本期视频是杰弗里·萨克斯教授近日参加油管访谈的节选。他列举金砖国家，特别是中国，在过去30到40年所取得的巨大发展成就，批评西方国家，特别是美国，还活在对中国过去的想象当中。我们看看他是怎么说的吧。
With the decolonization, the end of European imperial power, starting at the end of World War II and into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, sometimes with these wars of independence, sometimes peacefully, countries started to develop literacy and school systems and infrastructure and technology. And lo and behold, of course, this came most dramatically in East Asia. First, Japan's recovery after losing the Second World War, the War of the Pacific. Then countries like Korea, Singapore, and parts of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Then China started its remarkable catching up around 1980 when Deng Xiaoping, probably the greatest economic reformer in history in the scale of individual impact, helped to change the Chinese approach to an open economy and a market economy. And China had dramatic growth for 4 decades from 1980 to 2020. India started fast growth about 20 years behind China. And when you look at it today, and this is the bottom line of the question, I hope I didn't just ramble on uselessly, but
no, it's a fascinating history.
The bottom line is that if you look just 30 years ago, the so-called G7 countries, the big 7 on our side, quote unquote, the US, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, that was nearly 50% of world output. And if you look at what today we call the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now a number of new members, Egypt, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran.
And
that grouping,
Turkey,
yeah, and maybe Turkey soon. And there, by the way, there are dozens that want to join that grouping. But those 9, back in 1994, just 30 years ago, had about 18% of world output as a share. This is taking the gross domestic products, that measure of the size of an economy, at what we call purchasing power parity. So in other words, more technical issues, but when you compare economies, you use a certain standard. And the G7 was about 45% of world output, and the BRICS countries were about 18%. Now it's all flipped. Now the BRICS countries are about 36% of world output, double what they were 30 years ago. And the share of the G7, which is us and those other large so-called Western countries, plus Japan, are now about 29%. So the BRICS group is larger than the US-based group. Now, here's the issue that I keep coming back to. In Washington, of course, this is a kind of panic to the level of neurotic state of anxiety. To me, as an economist, it's good. You know, other countries are catching up. They're not in poverty anymore. Isn't that nice? But if you're playing a board game, who's on top? Not, are you well off? Oh, this is horrible. They're catching up. And what it does mean is that the U.S., which would snap its finger and get its way, can't do that anymore. The United States finds itself even isolated on issues like Israel and Palestine, just alone with Israel right now. Yeah, the king of Bahrain goes to Moscow. He goes to Beijing.
Right,
this is the real life.
Let me just stop you for a minute and thank you very much for the really superb history. Does the government of the United States, does our hegemonic culture, that we are the indispensable country, understand what you just described.
Not at all. It's so weird. And it's very annoying to me, Judge, because these are my students, many of them. So they just have to listen to their old professor. They do not understand this. Biden, of course, he lives in the past. You listen to him, he lives in his imagination of the 1980s and 1990s. But there's been a generation, I've watched it at the Harvard Kennedy School or at Columbia or elsewhere. These people are taught you are the unipolar power. They're not taught that by me, but they are taught that by a lot of our international relations professors. And by the way, they're paid to learn this because the military-industrial complex supports a lot of these institutions, these so-called think tanks, which aren't thinking very hard. My work for the last 40 years is working in places we call the emerging and developing economy. So I go to China several times a year. I've watched it for 43 years now with my own eyes. It was poor in 1981 when I first got to Beijing. There were no personal cars at all. People were wearing Mao suits. There were a lot of bicycles on the street, but there were no personal vehicles at all. It was impoverished. This was just after the end of the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping had just come to power. Now you go and you see there are more than 100 cities in China of more than 1 million people. Sometimes you go to gleaming metropolises in China, gleaming fancy stores, and you realize, gee, I never even heard of this city before I arrived here earlier today. I mean, that's literally happened to me on a number of occasions because there are more than 100. I don't know many of them, but I go there for visits or to give a lecture, and you see the wealth. And when you travel around the world, you see how much change. And by the way, I take heart from it because I want people to live well. I don't want people to live in misery so the United States can say we're number one. I want people to live well. And I don't think they get this in Washington. They are trash talking China until today. Why? China's not a threat to us. It is not an enemy to us. It's just catching up for lost time. And by the way, a lot of the lost time came from the horrible misdeeds by the United States, by Britain, by other Western powers, and by Japan on China in what they call the century of humiliation from 1839 to 1949. What happened? China was repeatedly invaded by, quote, our side. You know, Britain went to war in China in 1839 for what? Well, it's called the First Opium War because Britain told the Chinese leaders, you must open your markets to our opium because we want to get rich addicting the Chinese people. And when the Chinese leaders said no, the British invaded. They did that twice, again in the 1850s. We're nasty. This is what real imperialism is about. Of course, Japan invaded in the 1890s. It invaded in the 1930s. China's making up for lost time. Are they an enemy? No. The problem for the United States is there are a lot of Chinese people, 1.4 billion. We're 335 million. We're a fourth of the Chinese population. So now that China is about 30% or 1/3 of our living standards, but 4 times the population, if you do the arithmetic, they're a larger economy than we are. How dare they be a larger economy, say our policymakers. We need to contain them. We need to stop them. This is the mindset in Washington that's so dangerous right now. And they don't understand that what's happening is good. Actually, the United States wanted to spread the benefits of modern technology. It helps all of us that we don't have a world of impoverishment elsewhere and instability. And a bigger market means more innovations, and it means better living standards if we use it right rather than for all these horrible and useless wars. But when you ask, do they understand this? No, because the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'm a member, publishes a journal called Foreign Affairs, and it's frankly, like a neurotic journal, because every issue is, oh, yes, the United States can stay number one. Not can the United States be safe, healthy, prosperous, but can it be number one? That's what counts to them, not to me. What counts for me is our security, our safety, our well-being.